Well, we've done it, everyone. We finally made it to the end of the book of Jeremiah. We are at chapter 52, and at the chapter 52 mark, we hit a little bit of a deviation from what we've been doing. Seems like a weird time to have a deviation, but you see, what's been happening for the first 51 chapters of this book is basically the writings of Jeremiah and then his main assistant, basically Baruch. And these two individuals have been documenting all of these different prophecies, what God has been telling Jeremiah, the actions of the people surrounding Jeremiah, and then predictions of what is going to be based on what God is telling Jeremiah. So we have all these different books that we've gone through, all these different warnings, but what you hit once you get to chapter 52 is something that wasn't written until 25 years after the rest of the book of Jeremiah. This is the point where a lot of individuals who are now sitting in captivity are now cataloging and are documenting all these different writings, assembling them together into something that is documenting the core writings of their faith. And so in here you have something that some think was written by Baruch and some people think was written by, the editors putting this book together, and yet others think maybe it was individuals who were assisting Baruch. Regardless of what you think, what you have is a book that is looking back retrospectively at the things Jeremiah said and basically saying, yeah, come to find out that what the prophet Jeremiah said is exactly what has come to fruition. And what we start out with is looking at these kings. Now, if you recall, we had several kings that popped up over the course of this entire book. Some we went over in a little bit more detail and some we did not. It started out with King Josiah, who was a righteous king, and then it went to his son Jehoahaz that was really only there for 3 months. We barely even mentioned him. And then after that, you had Jehoiakim, and that's who he spoke about the most. It was this evil king who did basically what he wanted. He did what he thought was wise. After that, you have another king that sounds the same, but this is very slightly different. That's Jehoiachin, or some parts of the Bible call him Jeconiah. This is a very common thing at this day and age that people would have these multiple names. And Jehoiachin is an individual who ends up also only reigning for a very short period of time, but he ends up going into exile. He gets taken by King Nebuchadnezzar and taken over to Babylon. Now, there's a reason why I went into all that detail, and especially if your mind kind of starts swirling a little bit hearing all these names, I promise you there will be some payoff here at the very end. But what I want to do is jump to now the last king we have in Judah, and it's a king that is basically a puppet king who has been put in place by Nebuchadnezzar, and he is King Zedekiah. And Zedekiah is the last individual that we see in here, and he ended up reigning for about 11 years. For 9 of those years, he was a puppet king. He did what King Nebuchadnezzar wanted, but then he decided to rebel. Now, here's the deal. Jeremiah, as he was prophesying about what was going to take place, was very careful to note the fact that God was working through what was described as his servant, King Nebuchadnezzar. It's interesting language because of what we talked about in some of the previous sermons, that God works through these pagan individuals. I think a lot of times people get this weird idea that if somebody is successful, it must be because God's blessing them. Sometimes God is blessing them because God's just going to use them as a tool, whether they recognize God's sovereignty or not. And that's exactly what's happening with King Nebuchadnezzar. You have God using this pagan king in a way that is going to glorify his creation, whether Nebuchadnezzar recognizes he's subservient to God or not. So Jeremiah gave these warnings to Zedekiah, to these other Judean kings, saying that God is handing over to King Nebuchadnezzar control of all of these lands, and so you should submit and you should surrender. Zedekiah doesn't do that, and what that does is it leads to his destruction. Now, when we see the destruction of Zedekiah, that basically is the end of the kingship of Israel. And that's important because a lot of individuals had put their faith in the covenant of God in this man-made institution of the king. You know, if you think about it, they basically took everything that they thought about their faith in God, and then they superimposed that onto this worldly image of some earthly ruler. And I want you to think about Christianity and how many people do that today. I mean, you see it in how many people will talk about church hurt. Maybe you yourself have even done this, where, you know, there will be someone who has an experience with a church, and then they'll turn around and then superimpose who God is onto that church and say, well, that church hurt me and therefore God hurt me. Or that pastor said something untrue and therefore God must be untrue. Or I know these people who are Christians and they were judgmental and hypocritical and unloving, and therefore God must be judgmental, hypocritical, and unloving. It's a very human thing to do, but therein lies the trap. We have to remember that God is God and everything else is not. God is supreme, God is sovereign, God is perfect, God is unyielding, and things of men are none of those things. And so it's a cautionary tale for all of us to check our hearts and ask ourselves, in what are we actually placing our trust? And are we too, just like the people of Israel and Judea, are we superimposing God onto worldly things and then turning around and blaming God when those worldly things inevitably fail? Now, as we continue going on in chapter 52, we run into one of these sections that every now and then you hit in the Old Testament where you kind of look at all the detail and say, why are we going through all of this? I don't see why all this is important at all. When we hit those sections, it's very easy for us, as we're reading it, to just kind of glaze over it a little bit and kind of go like, yeah, lots of numbers, that's fine, whatever. But this one's actually important, and so I think sometimes digging into this is kind of interesting. Once you get to this middle section of chapter 52, you start seeing this almost accounting or auditing of all these different treasures that King Nebuchadnezzar had seized from the temple and taken back to Babylon, never to return. Now, that was important because of something that happened much earlier. We kind of touched on it a little bit when we talked about how the kings and how the prophets and priests were letting down the people of Judea. But there was a specific individual that was Hananiah. And Hananiah was an individual that was a fake prophet. He was an individual that basically was trying to give feel-good prophecies that would resonate with the leaders and the people so that they would, kind of feel better. And we don't really have good insights into why he was doing this. Maybe it was personal gain. Maybe it's because he enjoyed the status that he had being a prophet. Maybe it was because he wanted to get in the good graces of the rulers so that they would continue supporting his access and his role amongst society. Regardless of the motivation, what you can tell was that there was this attempt to give this very flowery view of what was going to happen. So while Jeremiah was saying, Judah, you have been disobedient, because of that you will be destroyed. Babylon will come in and then they will scatter you. The people will be ripped away from the land. You had this Hananiah individual that was turning around and saying, but after 2 years, all of a sudden, God will destroy Babylon and all of these things will return and you will come back to the land. And I'm sure that made people feel very good. But there was death and danger in those sweet lies. This is one of those things that you end up seeing, come to fruition in chapter 52, where all of these fake truths obviously were fake. And so you could imagine the disappointment. You could imagine how hard that may have been for some of the individuals that believe these false truths because they felt good at the time, just down the road to find out that that's not reality. Once again, it's a great cautionary tale for us as Christians, because there's so many individuals out there who want to feed us that sweet false truth because they want to sell more books, or they want you to do their Bible study, or they want you to be a part of their megachurch, or whatever it may be. And it's not just something with like big celebrities. I mean, smaller, pastors and leaders do the exact same thing. Everybody wants to be the bearer of good news. Nobody wants to be the individual who turns around and says, you know what? I don't know what God's will is in this, maybe God's will is not that that person's going to get better. Maybe God's will is not that you get that job that you were hoping for. Sometimes the truth is something that isn't very fun to give, but ultimately it's freeing, because in that truth is where you start seeing the sovereignty and the dominion of God over all things. You start seeing that God is bigger than you, that God is bigger than your understanding, and God is bigger than your circumstances. And because of that, what you have is ultimately an enduring sense of peace and an enduring sense of faith that you have in this God that is bigger than yourself. But it's definitely not convenient all the time. And so the question that we have to wrestle with as we sit here and we look at what happened to these false prophets, these individuals who bought into it, are we listening to sweet truths because we think that that sounds better, or it makes us feel better in our heart? And if we are listening to this false theology that just feels good, what do we expect is going to happen when the reality of this world smacks us upside the head? Now, do you remember the very beginning of this when I went through all of those kings and I said, just hang on to this, we'll get back to it? Well, we're getting back to it now. This Jehoiachin, or this Jeconiah that sometimes you'll see it referred to in the Bible, this Jehoiachin was an individual who he himself only reigned for a few months before King Nebuchadnezzar came in, sieged Jerusalem, he surrendered, and then he got taken away. Now, I want you to remember what Jeremiah told all of these other kings. He said, I am raising up this King Nebuchadnezzar, and I am making all these other powers subservient to him. God referring to King Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. And so as a result of that, the warning to those Judean leaders was to submit to this pagan king, because this is a part of your discipline. This is a part of my judgment over you, is to make you subservient to these other powers so that you will be forced to rely on me and your faith in me. Well, that is basically what Jehoiachin did. Jehoiachin was not a good king. He was referred to in 2 Kings as an evil king, but yet he did that one thing correctly. He surrendered, and as a result, he was taken to Babylon and not slaughtered like Zedekiah and so many of these other more evil kings that were rebellious. Here's what's fascinating, though, is what you end up reading at the very, very end. It's the last bit of the entire book of Jeremiah, is what happens to Jehoiachin. He's been sitting for over 2 decades in prison, even clothed as a prisoner, and yet at this point in time there's another Babylonian king is raised up. He pardons Jehoiachin, and at that point in time he is actually blessed and elevated in the courts of the Babylonian king. Now, the reason why this is so important is twofold. The first reason is this, is because it reinforces that God is faithful, that even an individual who is disobedient, who is referred to as an evil king in 2 Kings, even that king is an individual who goes off, and so long as you hold on to the faith of the promise that we have in God, God will not forget you. God will remember you. And we pray that he blesses us. But whether he blesses us in this life or the next, we know that God's goodness will come to fruition. But there's a second reason why this is important. And the second reason is this. Recall that the prophecy that Jeremiah gave in the Book of Comfort was that the throne of David would be occupied forever. Well, we know as Christians that the individual who sits on the King of David, that was all the prophecy, is Jesus Christ, an individual who was born in the city of David, a part of that tribe. Well, what that means is that there needs to be connective tissue that goes all the way back through the kingship of Israel and Judea. So what happens is when Jehoiachin is pardoned and he's actually elevated within the Babylonian court, he's actually, we know this from archaeological finds, that he's actually referred to very much as the rightful king of Judah. So what that means is that through that that root right there, you have traceability that goes all the way up until Jerusalem is eventually rebuilt and restored. The temple is restored and consecrated again by Ezra. And then that continues all the way up until you have Jesus Christ coming from that same root. And so what you have in here is this picture of God ensuring that his plan comes to fruition, that every prophecy that was given, that on the throne of David would come a righteous root that would sit on the throne forever and that would bless all people in all nations, that all of that comes to fruition regardless of how bleak everything would have looked to the people contemporaneous with the events taking place. You can imagine the individuals that were living through the slaughter, that were living through all of the violent acts of King Nebuchadnezzar, how it would have been very easy for them to look and say, well, where's God in this? I don't see him. I can't understand him. So I just won't believe anymore. But what you see through what Jeremiah prophesied and through what the authors of this last chapter are reaffirming and validating is that what Jeremiah prophesied came true because God is faithful. And the reason why all this can happen is because of something that we reinforced in messages in the past, that God is sovereign. A theme that is written all over the entire book of Jeremiah, that God is sovereign over all. And that even in the midst of God's discipline, even in the midst of God's permissible will, permitting these different trials and these different tribulations to happen to us, even through all of that, we can have faith that God's grace and God's love is going to reign supreme because God has dominion over all of our goods, over all of our bads, over all of our victories, and over all of our defeats. And in fact, it's in those trials and defeats that we can have the most faith because it's in those moments that oftentimes we have to rely on God. And when we have to rely on God, it's a heck of a lot easier to actually see him actively working in our lives and doing amazing things. So that's our lesson I have for today. I hope you enjoyed the entire book of Jeremiah. And until we meet again, God bless.